All right. So yeah, that's just the membership of the advisory group and why we are looking for your input from those particular groups. Once again, the key goals for our transportation and parking analysis were to improve communication, accessibility, standardization, and enforcement. And I hope the ordinance that we're proposing tonight does satisfy those goals. As an ADA overview, the current regulations, once again, we are not required by federal ADA law to provide on-street ADA parking spaces. Currently, they're locally authorized by the village manager, as Becky was saying before. Not exactly sure why or how that process came to be, but we think there's a lot of room for improvement within that. Within that conversation, the board currently does already allow loading zones and parklets, which also take up similar right-of-way as special privileges. So we as staff believe that's the most consistent way to deal with these things. So with respect to standardization, our ordinance amendment would treat them similarly. Once again, the analysis did recommend that we do provide them. So despite the ADA requirement, or the non-requirement, I should say, of the federal law, the analysis suggested that it was a good thing for us to do as a welcoming practice. The analysis did recommend to limit them to one space per block, which in the last meeting I shared is somewhat awkward because the definition of block is never consistent. And then additionally, if you have two people requesting on one block, it just gets competing. Why allow one and not the other? So we did not necessarily keep that recommendation, as you'll see. The analysis recommended customer service to be the intake of these requests, but as with other special privileges, my department actually does that. So whether I like it or not, it makes the most sense for my department to continue that process. So we will be changing that to my department. And then to review and install by Public Works, we did keep that because obviously they maintain the right-of-way and they need to be involved with the installation of signage. As a reminder, the city of Milwaukee, they do not allow this in residential areas, and so we are going above what they do in terms of our regional neighbor. They follow PROAG, which says that, and that's public right-of-way accessibility guidance. That states that if you were to mark or meter your stalls, you should provide a certain percentage, but in residential areas, they are neither marked nor metered, and so they do not feel obligated to do that. So just for reference, the city of Milwaukee does not accept residential applications. And then on July 29th, we met for the first time to discuss this, at which point those present suggested that staff pursue a broad, inclusive strategy to allow people to request them and to provide them as best as we can without any sort of fee. It was discussed that this would be the most welcoming kind of community if we could do that. So with that guidance, we have the following recommendation, which was also in your packet. In order to do anything, we'll need to update the ordinance, so village board approval will be required. And so our ordinance update has been prepared. There's no need for a corresponding policy. I know sometimes the board always asks this question of why do we have multiple things? We have ordinances, policies, resolutions, et cetera. Sometimes the policy is necessary to help internal practice guide how we do these things, but since it's relatively straightforward, there is no need for a policy in this case. So we've only prepared an ordinance update. And there's also no fee schedule update because there is no fee proposed with this. So it's relatively straightforward that we would just be looking to update the code. With that, we would get rid of the existing section 513, which is titled Authority to Designate Parking Zones for Handicap. And in exchange, we would update our loading zone code to include definitions for both an accessible loading zone, and that relates to active loading and unloading, and then a accessible parking zone. That's something where you could park for multiple hours on end. The need for the distinction there is, for example, at Lake Bluff Elementary School, they requested and received permission for an accessible loading zone, but it does not allow you to park there the full day. So if for some reason, someone wanted to park in that zone all day long, they could not. They need to be actively loading or unloading passengers. So there is a need for the distinction. And I should say, feel free to jump in if you have any questions. I tend to talk too much, too fast, too excitedly, so let me know. Within our recommendation, we would allow special privilege permits for loading and parking zones via special privilege approval. Those are typically approved by the board, but we don't think in this case the board would actually need to be involved. If we are, in fact, making an inclusive process, we think internally we can handle that ourselves. So they would be reviewed by me in conjunction with the police department and public works. If you read the proposal, you'll note that we would approve them based on the presence of adequate, unprohibited parking space adjacent to the applicant's property. And I think this might be something worth just clarifying or discussing. So if by chance you lived in front of a fire hydrant and the fire hydrant prohibited, a parking zone in front of your property, in that case, based on our review, we would deny that request. Simply because the desire or need for an accessible loading zone is to get close to your property and not to, park in front of someone else's house necessarily. So in that particular instance, if there was something prohibiting you from parking directly in front of your property, whether that's no parking on that side of the street or a fire hydrant or a crosswalk or something, I would deny that based on, whatever that parameter is. The applicant would then have the right to appeal that to the village board, and the village board could then perhaps weigh in more creatively on that. But just in terms of a standard procedure, the village planning and development director would approve requests subject to that adequate space. We would not limit them per block. So if by chance there were 2 on a block or within 100 feet of each other or whatnot, we would not consider that as a reason for denial. Any denials could be taken to the village board. Within a residential area, we would request that proof of disability be provided. That disability would need to be a permanent disability. We're not in the, you don't have the staff capacity and or budget or reactionary time to provide, temporary loading zones every time they're requested. This would be more of a permanent situation. So if you have that proof, we would then approve it. If you didn't, we would, not be able to approve it. They would be renewed annually in May, just so that we know if the need is still there. As I've mentioned in previous meetings, we have instances where they've been approved in the past and we simply don't have the tracking of them. So for all we know, that person has moved and or no longer needs it, but the sign is still out there. So this annual review process would help us, eliminate that likelihood. And then based on previous conversation, we would not be recommending a fee be involved. Obviously, there would be costs incurred with the actual signage, and so offsetting those costs, that signage fee would likely need to be charged against some sort of parking revenue generation, whether that's permits or otherwise. We would need to identify that specific account for the board to approve that. But without the fee, we just need to acknowledge that the costs associated with the signs, which could be up to 4, would be covered elsewhere. So.
Hey, Bart.
Yep.
In reading through the stuff before the meeting and based on what you're saying here, it sounds like all of this is by request only. Is that correct? Like, you guys aren't planning on dropping some more on-street accessible parking unrequested. Is that right?
Correct. So it would be based on request in residential and commercial areas. The only difference is that within the draft, I've noted that the village board may direct the director of public works to designate and install accessible loading zones or accessible parking zones adjacent to public property. That specifically will come into play likely with Atwater Park, where we've heard several requests for such a space. So since that isn't adjacent to residential or commercial property, in that case, the board would direct Director of Public Works to do so.
Okay. So we don't see a need for this if it's not asked for?
I have not received requests for it. In general, I know, Becky, I know that you've got perhaps some better, more specific examples, but the bid, once again, I wish Jake was here. The bid has never asked for this to be, distributed amongst spaces. The only time it's ever come in is when a specific business indicates that they have clientele that could use it, but it's never been a general request, at least to my department. And like I said, Becky, maybe you can provide a little additional information.
I would guess that there are, well, I would guess that the bid, any business is generally not going to want to see a parking space. I mean, it's not removed, but it's taken out of circulation for the majority of the time, because I'm guessing it's not going to be used nearly as much as a regular parking space. So I find it hard to believe that that would happen. But I was just curious, what was prompting this?
So we will get requests from residents to have parking marked off for ADA purposes. Many times when we receive the request, I think people are intending it to be for specifically them, which we would not have an ability to do. So if, a stall is marked
Ability to do that. We don't?
for specific people with on-street stalls.
Yeah, I thought the current ordinance allows people to ask for one and the board can approve it. Did I read that incorrectly?
Yes, but it can't be specific to people. So for example, if someone with an ADA tag, any person with an ADA tag would be
Right.
able to park within that particular stall.
Oh, so what we're talking about is a specifically assigned ADA spot for an individual license plate?
No, not for individual license plate because it's a public street.
Right.
So you wouldn't want to designate a stall for a specific vehicle. It has to be designated for
A specific person?
ADA in general.
Well, okay, that's what I mean. So, but we already can do that. Or what you're saying is what we can do is only for a specific person.
No, I'm saying that we can currently designate stalls at this time. There's never been a finalized process for going about doing it. And there's also never been discussion about renewal. So for specifically, you could have someone request an ADA stall on their street for a particular person who lives with them at a period of time. You don't know if that's still necessary in following years. So it becomes a question of, well, is the signage, necessary? Can it be updated? Having an inventory of that, assessing how many can go in a particular block, and if the functionality of where it was located would work.
Oh, okay. Because the only one I know of is on Oakland in front of an apartment building kind of across from Draft and Vessel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's the only commercial one.
Yeah. Is that the only one in the village?
No, there's a handful of them sprinkled in residential neighborhoods. I know I pass on Murray when I bike in every day. And that one is actively used, so I'm sure it still would be requested. But like that one across on Oakland, I don't know the history of that or who requested it. I hope it's being used. I don't know if it is or not. In last meeting, I had asked Leonard whether or not he's ever had a request from one of his tenants. So I don't know who.
We haven't that I can remember.
So yeah, the history of that one in Oakland, I don't know that I know the answer to that. And it's not that it's a bad thing to be out there if it's being utilized, but if it's not being utilized or needed, I guess to the flip point of the conversation, well then perhaps it could be opened up for general parking. But if there is a greater demand for general ADA parking on Oakland or Capitol, I would love for the bid's perspective on that. So I might reach out to Jake and or Steph specifically before the board, hears this proposal. But nowhere within the 2 years of the study or the subsequent meetings have I really heard a desire for that. I think in general it sounds like a great idea, but if there really is no need for it or really no push for it, this particular process doesn't proactively place them within the commercial district, only against public property such as parks.
Right. So you're just trying to update and clarify a process so that.
Correct. Yep.
Have something decent moving forward.
Yeah, it's not a huge change, quite honestly. It's just a more defined change. So to the goals within the study, it standardizes it. It makes it easier for us to communicate and enforce. So it's not a huge change. It's not taking away anything that's already out there. It's just kind of confirming how we would handle these moving forward. Because to Becky's earlier point, the village manager per code is allowed to do it, but there's no process or tracking method for that, and that's just not the best way to maintain your right of way. So
okay,
this is it's it's not a huge change, so hopefully that's, acceptable.
Yeah, makes sense.
I had a couple questions. On, what is that road? Olive, you go by Kingo Lutheran in the side street there. They put out temporary ADA loading zone signs at church time. And then they wheel the signs back in their building. So this would kind of solve their problem if they requested it, right?
Yeah, that's a great example, and because it happens on the weekend, we don't necessarily see that, but in theory, they shouldn't be, doing that themselves. I don't think we'd have a problem with giving them, a loading zone for that purpose, so I think that would help solve that particular instance, and I think if we can communicate that to people, we might have more people asking or requesting for that.
Right.
Like I said, the only example I can think of is Lake Bluff, where that specifically was reviewed and approved by the board.
Yeah, I think when residents, the whole reason we're doing this is to make Shorewood more friendly to people with ADA needs, right? So
Correct, yep.
we put in a process and then we communicate about it so they're aware of it and they can take advantage of it if they're willing. Will you be tracking now with this audit plan that you have in place? Will you know how
Yes.
many you have and keeping them up to date?
Yep, so like the loading zones, every year in the spring, we run a report of things that were approved the year prior, and that triggers us to send a letter to ask for renewal, and gives a deadline. So if you want to renew it, to respond by a certain date, and then we would, in this case, administratively approve it if nothing's changed. So yes, this would give us the opportunity to follow up on those and ideally remove them if they're no longer needed.
Yep. And keep track of how many we have and yeah.
Yep, and yeah, to one of Becky's other points too, the opportunity to start reporting on some of these metrics. So as I'll report later in the parking update, we will be providing a 6-month update to the board on how the permit figures are working themselves out, because it's one of those things where it's a great estimate, but we don't actually know how reality is going to impact that. So right now, I can say there's a handful of ADA parking spaces out in the village, but that's not a real number, obviously. It'd be great to know if that's 3 or if that's 12. So moving forward, hopefully we can provide better data on this topic.
Okay.
And I thought it was worth sharing too, if people weren't at the last meeting. I know that, Rachel from Bike Ped was there, and I kind of appreciated her perspective on this in terms of ADA in the commercial zone specifically, in terms of a desire for people to bike or walk to or within the district anyways. And so losing a space to someone who actually needs it, in her mind, was well worth it, because the goal in a walkable community is to allow people to, walk and bike in a more friendly atmosphere anyways, so there shouldn't be competition for the spot right out in front of anyone anyways. So that perspective I thought was worth sharing last time, that if someone actually does need this, it makes complete sense to allow them to have access to it, whereas someone else can easily park 10 feet away, a block away, choose a different option. So she's not here tonight, so I just wanted to reiterate what she had shared last time. So anything else specific to this particular topic? The one question I do still sometimes get debated on is with respect to, if I can't park in front of my street, then I can't, or in front of my house, then I can't request one. And quite honestly, I don't know that I have a different proposal, because I often hear the exact opposite of people calling, whether it's my department or customer service, saying, why is someone parking in front of my house? I don't like it. I'm not saying I agree with that perspective, but I feel like the concept of applying to place a stall in front of someone else's house would be much more controversial with respect to, competition for that space. So like I said, the current proposal says if it's available in front of your house, I can administratively approve it. If it's not, I would deny it. It would have to go to the board for a more nuanced conversation. It's never our goal to take, those kind of controversial actions to the board, but just internally, I can't think of a better way to process, a straightforward response other than, if it's available, we can provide it. If it's not, I would just deny it. And if you really need it, then you can, take it to the board.
Okay.
So if you have any other thoughts on that, feel free to let me know. I think our hope, Becky, correct, is to take this to the board on December 21st. So we do have some time. I do need to, and I will reach out to our village attorney to make sure that the ordinance update, matches his understanding of acceptability in terms of the legal requirements. I will also share, Tim did email me his thoughts, and he just said, I'm in favor of the proposal as it's written. I think it's a more community-oriented in every sense of the word. So obviously the school district has their own parking needs, and so with respect to they think this does meet their expectations. So
have there been any objections to it, Bart?
No, nope. And it's one of those things where it really is kind of a technical administrative thing. So I think people might need more time to comprehend it. But to one of my responses to John before, it's not really changing much other than just making things more comprehensible to us. We're not taking things away. We're just giving people an option to do it. So I hope it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Yeah, I get it.
But yeah, I will reach out to the bids specifically to see if they've ever heard or identified other needs. But other than that, I thank you for your review. And if you have any other comments, feel free to pass them along. Like I said, December 21st would be the board consideration if it stays on schedule. So with that, I can also provide a quick update on those parking changes that we worked, for 2 years on. So hopefully they're worth it and well received. So the permits will be available in mid-December for purchase for January. The changes allow for the purchase of an on-street overnight parking permit at $40 per month at 2 per household. You can also still purchase an off-street lot at $30 a month. Both of those previously were $50 a month, so the board did reduce them somewhat. There was some perspective to reduce them even more, but in terms of not understanding the permit numbers, I think this was the figures they settled on, and then we will report back in 6 months after we know better how well they're being purchased or not purchased. So we look forward to actually having some data to respond with, which I think will be great for everyone. And so it's kind of an incremental approach in terms of allowing it to happen. And then if by chance we can reduce them or if we need to increase them for whatever that's worth, we can do that based more on some statistics as opposed to some estimates. As a reminder, the 20 free permissions have not changed, so every vehicle still does get 20 free permissions, so that was not touched. One of the more nuanced conversations that took place was the introduction of enforcement of alternate side night parking. And so in order to allow for adequate street maintenance and to make sure that vehicles are being moved, once every 24 hours, as the code requires, if we do in fact have areas that are parked up more fully now with this on-street permit, the board requested that we begin enforcement of that. And so it previously was in the code, but it had not been enforced for some time. We did modify it to say on the even sides of the street, on the even days, and odd on odd. And now that's between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. So if you park, at 10 p.m. on an odd day, you'll need to understand that we enforce it on the even day. So there will be some learning curve with this, we expect. And so our enforcement personnel have been directed to give a one-time warning. And there's a large communication plan, which I shared in your packet. But we still do expect there to be hiccups on this because it is kind of one of those things that people are not used to. And then our street pattern is quite unique in the respect that many streets in Shorewood don't even allow two-sided parking. And so if you live on one of those streets where it's either prohibited because of a seasonal regulation, i.e. winter from December to March, or just if it's prohibited year-round, alternate side parking would not be required. So there will be plenty of instances where alternate side parking, isn't required, but other places where it is. And so that's also been confusing to some people, but unfortunately or fortunately, we have the street grid that we do. In many places, it's very narrow. That's a benefit to, slow streets and walkable neighborhoods, but it's not a benefit towards, a plethora of parking. So we do anticipate that this alternate side parking will continue to require some communication efforts. And so we've outlined what we're currently planning on doing, and we'll see in January where that comes in. once again, we look forward to being able to report back to the board on how, this is taken, but we have to start somewhere is where it amounts to. So I know you've all been involved in that discussion. It's just a matter of clarifying it to people that ask, and I know that we're starting to get questions already, and so it could be a learning curve for a lot of us. Any questions on the update in terms of implementation January 1st?
Well, I just know our people at Eastmore are thrilled with it. They're relieved
That's great to
that
hear.
you're doing it. So we've had a very favorable response from our employees who, do the leasing and managing of apartments and that kind of thing. So it's very much noticed.
Leonard, do you have any idea of how many of your residents are gonna snap this up right away?
I have no idea. Should I get an idea? Let you know?
I was just curious because you have hundreds of units in Shorewood, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I would guess that there's a fair amount of pent up demand.
Oh yeah.
Maybe not quite yet. Maybe because people have been living under the current status quo, they either don't have a car but moving forward, I could see people getting a car or new residents coming in, having cars. So
It's a great draw for people wanting to live in Shorewood to have this parking option.
yeah, especially for some of your buildings that are landlocked. I know just seeing your signs, you've got a lot of buildings that have zero parking, probably.
Zero parking, right. Right.
Well, so they have zero parking, but we have offered them special permits.
Right.
Yep.
So it's not that they haven't had any on-street parking opportunities. It's been very limited. So yeah, whether or not there's a excess demand was what we're going to find out. But many of them we hope just transition from purchasing it from Leonard's, personnel to purchasing it straight through us and cutting out that middle person.
Yep.
And we don't know if there's going to be a double or triple effect of that with residential units, but it was largely seen as an equity issue within the discussion in terms of Shorewood is a majority renter community, and to not have that as an offering really was seen as limiting and not welcoming towards the reality of our housing makeup. So I think discussing that in terms of equity really drove home the fact that this needed to be addressed. And so hopefully the permit numbers come in and it all works itself out. But if not, 6-month review will give us a better understanding of what that demand was. So Leonard, whether or not you know that offhand, we hope to find that out for ourselves in 6 months.
Great. Fabulous.
So with that, I have no real other updates. Those were the two topics that we had on tonight's conversation. So I'll keep you posted on how ADA turns out. If you have further thoughts, please let me know. We will be working pretty diligently in the early part of 2021 to understand and implement this parking change. But there's still plenty of other things in that study that are worth bringing back to you, including resident requests for stop signs. I know that's one of my immediate ones. And then next year, the board really does want to tackle winter regulations and how we currently do them and how we could or should do them. So the goal is to have that modified or at least reconfirmed sometime by next summer so that we have adequate time to update signage and communicate things to everyone. So hopefully in the spring, early summer, we can start tackling and or define how to move forward on winter parking. So the good news is there's plenty of work to still be done. So we'll keep hammering away at it. And I'll just keep you posted as we get things available on our plates that we can cross them off as we see them.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for joining, everyone. We will be in touch.
Okay, have a great
See you
night.
guys.
You
Okay,
too.
Good night.
bye.
Bye.